Hey guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and more importantly, welcome to the second episode of the weekly podcast that I do. So this is going to cover the markets from the dates of 7th of January to the 11th. And for those of you that don't know what this podcast is basically every week on a Saturday you get an upload which basically explains how the last week went for the markets, what were sort of the driving factors, what things were to sort of that factored that were the catalyst for that week and that could potentially play out into the next week. So let's begin. So let's start first at how the week played out for the S&P 500 mainly. End up 3% about 3% on the week, which is pretty good considering we had a real slump in the indices in December. So I guess we're getting a bit of a late Santa rally right now. The FTSE 100 did roughly the same. If we just have a quick look as well on that. Obviously now is the futures market, so that's why they're showing more data. But otherwise it's from here. So yeah, around 3% as well, 2 to 3% on the FTSE 100. So it's a pretty good week for the markets. We've now approached close to 10% from its lows that we had in December or Christmas time. Now, I don't know if many of you got a chance to see the interview with David Rubenstein and Jerome Powell. So that was a great interview for anyone that watched it on Thursday. It basically gave a bit more of a dovish sound from obviously the chairman of the Fed, and that's always a good thing obviously for the markets. The markets don't want high interest rates for obvious reasons. But that being said, Jerome Powell always switches up his tone pretty much every TV interview that he gets, so it is something that you still should be quite cautious on. I wouldn't obviously go in along the market just because of what he had said. The only other thing that I think a lot of people need to be focusing on this week in particular, the next week in particular, is because we've had a good gain now in the market, close to 10% from its lows. We could be retesting those lows again in the following weeks, and the reason being is because especially next week is earnings season. So we got the likes of Apple reporting earnings, banks reporting earnings, so like Citigroup. I think Citigroup kick off on Monday. In fact, yeah, they do. On the 14th of January, Citigroup report. On Tuesday, it's Wells Fargo. On Wednesday, we got Goldman Sachs, BlackRock, Bank of America, and Merrill Lynch. So we have the banks reporting, which is definitely an important thing to see how the market plays out, because obviously banks are cyclicals, so they'll give a good indication. Even if you're someone who doesn't trade bank stocks, it'll give a good indication as to how the market is reacting into this current economic climate. And there are some tech names also reporting on later on that week. On Thursday, I believe Netflix is also reporting, which is a good one for sure for me personally, because I don't know if you watched one of my previous videos, I actually am quite tempted to get into Netflix, but it's obviously gained quite good momentum from its lows, so I'm still sitting on it. So yeah, the week has been pretty good for the markets. There is, that level of caution that should still be there, because we've had the gains that we were expecting from the bottom, which is 10-15% gains. So, and the VIX is now retracing back below 20 handle, which is obviously a positive sign for the markets in the short term. But yeah, I think the biggest catalyst or the biggest driver will be next week. Obviously now we're getting to earnings season and sort of understanding exactly, everyone's pretty much getting back to work, so it will be a good idea to see what actually goes on with this market. I am obviously not anticipating, to be honest, I'm not anticipating a rally next week in a sense for the market. I think the reports are going to be decent, but they're not going to be good enough, I think, to keep the market sustained at the current levels that we're at. But that being said, all eyes on the Fed still. The trade tensions between the US and China still haven't been fully resolved just yet. We are still, waiting on more news from the Trump administration and from President Xi Jinping. So that is still mounting. We have no idea yet exactly what's going to happen with them. Obviously, if that does happen to get resolved, there will be a good uproar in the market. So right now would be a great time, but it doesn't seem like there's anything starting just yet. And also another thing that's sort of uncertainty for the market, and also mentioned by Jerome Powell in his interview, was about whether the government shutdown can affect the market and sort of the economic climate going forward. And by his tone, in my opinion, it did sort of raise concerns about that it could the longer it goes on, because I think this is coming up too close to as ever been. I think it's been 20 days for the government shutdown, and obviously Trump is not going to back down until he gets what he wants, which is, the funding for the wall. So those are the main headlines this week, just to give you a quick roundup. So US and China trade tensions are still ongoing. Jerome Powell had a nice interview with David Rubenstein, which was helpful for the markets because he was showing a bit more signs of being dovish, but also again repeating about the data. And number three being the government shutdown, that it can, in his opinion, affect the future of the Fed, obviously, because it will affect the future of the economy. So that's also something to consider and look into. But yeah, otherwise the week has been pretty muted in terms of news, but it's been obviously a good week in the markets, 2-3% gains. And to end off, next week is really, really important for all traders' earnings seasons. There's going to be a lot of volatility. Make sure, if you are holding your stocks into the earnings period, to make sure they're hedged. And hopefully you have a great week next week. And next week we'll have a lot to talk about. So I hope to see you all back here next week for the weekly podcast. And especially any students out there that are watching, this will hopefully be helpful for you when you're preparing for your interviews. I've got some interviews videos coming out next week to help you prepare for your investment banking interviews. But other than that, I wish you all the best of luck in the markets, and I'll speak to you next week. Bye.